So, Namaskar, friends. In this lecture, we are going to talk about The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. As introduced earlier, The Namesake is the first novel by Jhumpa Lahiri and a very popular one. Is considered one of the most influential accounts of uh, life of diaspora in the US. The story tells us uh, the life of tells us about the life of uh, Gogol Ganguly, the son of Ashok and Asima Gangulis, both migrants to USA, and it's a multi generational story which captures 30 years of their life in the US. And so here we go. The plot of the novel follows the lives of the Ganguly family, as I said, Asima and Ashok Ganguly. They're Bengali immigrants who moved from Calcutta, India to the United States in the late 1960s. The story begins in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Asima and Ashok Ganguly, who are newly married through an arranged match, are adjusting to their new life far from home. Ashok is a graduate student at MIT pursuing his PhD degree in electrical engineering, while Asima, who mostly lives at home, grapples with homesickness and cultural isolation as he prepares to give birth to their first child. When their son is born, a series of circumstances leads to him being officially named Gogol after the Russian author Nikolai Gogol, a name with deep personal significance for Ashok, who survived a train accident in India while reading Gogol's work long back during his school days. So, Bengali tradition requires both a pet name which is used within the family and a formal name that is used publicly or in the school and other records. But the latter with the formal name from Asima's grandmother, who is supposed to, name the child being the eldest in the family. Uh, the letter never arrives, so Gogol becomes his legal name because in US a child has to be named before the child gets discharged from the hospital. And uh, after constant reminder from the hospital authorities, Ashok is forced to name him. uh, Without much thinking, he names him Gogol after his favorite writer Nikolai Gogol, and thus in his formal records this name is recorded as his formal name. As Gogol grows up in suburban America, his struggles with his unusual name, unusual because Gogol is not a common name in either India or US because it's a Russian name, and given the political turbulence between the two countries, US and Russia, it assumes a new you know um, complexity in America. So Gogol grows up in suburban America with struggles with his unusual name and the cultural expectations of his Bengali heritage. He feels out of place both at home and in American society, which leads to a sense of alienation and confusion about his own identity, adding to his anguish. So his parents, meanwhile, try to maintain their traditions like any other diasporic parent while adapting to American life, facing their own challenges of assimilation and homesickness. Because being the first generation diasporic who have had their formative years in India, they find it really difficult to change at this point in time in their life, and that's why it's more challenging for them to assimilate and maintain active ties with their uh, home and their family. Gogol eventually changes his name to Nikhil when he becomes an adult, because he has always struggled with his name. But prior to that, in his school, the parents, try to admit him under his good name, uh, which is Nikhil. But he does not respond to Nikhil because he is used to Gogol. And after repeated mentions of his name by the school teacher, when he fails to respond to them, the school teacher inquires why he is not responding to his name, and he says that Nikhil is not his name is Gogol. So at that point in time, Gogol becomes his good name. But later on, when he becomes an adult, and his friends also inquire about his strange name, he finds it difficult to really respond to them, and starts believing that there is something wrong with his name, Gogol, and as such decides to change his name. um, Here, one thing is important, that despite the reluctance of his parents, he does it at this point in time, which is also a mark of, let's say, protest on the part of uh, teenaged Gogol. uh, there is nothing unusual about it. Even in India, also, the teenagers have that sense that they are grown up now and they can take their decisions. But since Gogol is living in America, which allows him agency to take his decisions, that is also one of the reasons why the parents just give up, and he changes his name to Nikhil just before going to college, uh, to Yale University, where he is going to join his college for doing a major in architecture. So he assumes a new identity, believing that it will help him fit in better with his new peers. And then again, this is also a symbol of him distancing himself from everything Indian, everything that his parents and the people around them had known ever. See, he pursues a career in architecture and has relationships with women from different backgrounds, including Ruth Maxine, Maxine, who is a wealthy American, and later Mosumi, a fellow Bengali American, whom he marries, but the marriage ultimately fails because of the difficulties of balancing cultural expectations and personal desires. They both have been trained in American culture, and so they don't feel obliged to send down the same kind of strings to their relationship. And so they both think like two different individuals, and keep secrets as well. Mosumi indulges in an extramarital affair, and then citing the reasons of disloyalty, ultimately their relationship fails. After his father's sudden death, Gogol reconnects with his family and heritage, gaining a deeper understanding of his parents' sacrifices and the meaning behind his name. And this story concludes with Osima, the mother of Gogol, preparing to return to India, while Gogol, now more at peace with his identity, reflects on his family's journey and the ties that bind them across continents and generations. He ultimately finds solace in the Russian stories his father loved, symbolizing his acceptance of his complex heritage and the merging of his two identities. So, this novel turns out to be one of the masterpieces, and also symbolic representation of the diasporic philosophy of Jhumpa Lahiri. If you look at Jhumpa Lahiri, who was born Nilanjana Sudesana, this is also interesting that her pet name became her main name. So there is something that comes from her own struggles with her pet name. and you know uh, her acceptance of the same. Now all over the world she is known by her pet name as one of the uh, most influential contemporary names in Indian diaspora. So when we look at this novel, as I said, this is considered one of the most influential accounts of diasporic life. And first of all, we find that it is based on immigrant experience and cultural dislocation. And it starts with the parents themselves who migrate from India to US, and within US from one place to another, taking them uh, to different locales and adding to their growing isolation. So, in the earliest part of the novel, we find Asima reflecting to her own life. She is expecting Gogol, and at that point in time, there is nobody around her, and she feels eternally lonely. So, I quote from the novel: "For being a foreigner, Asima is beginning to realize is a sort of lifelong pregnancy, a perpetual weight, a constant burden, a continuous feeling out of sorts. It is an ongoing responsibility, a parenthesis in what had once been ordinary life, only to discover that that previous life has vanished, replaced by something more complicated and demanding. Like pregnancy, being a foreigner, Asima believes is something that elicits the same curiosity from strangers, the same combination of pity and respect. So, obviously, she feels lot of uh, loneliness and alienation in a world that is far from her accustomed familiar world, where she should have been, surrounded by her own family and friends, and life could have been different. And she compares it to pregnancy, but then when the pregnancy is gone, once the child is born, and the woman is relieved of the burden of carrying the child, here she says that, this is a feeling which looks like a perpetual pregnancy, and there is no unburdening. So obviously she feels uh, out of place. She always feels that there is something that stops him, something that, burdens her heart, and she is not able to live freely, breathe freely, or think clearly. This clearly outlines the plight of an expatriate in a foreign country. So these lines vividly convey the isolation, vulnerability, and resilience required to build a new life in an unfamiliar land, while also suggesting that the state of being a foreigner is not temporary but a lasting condition. So, Asima's lament: she has given birth to vagabonds. When she feels alone, the children are, busy in themselves. She again feels that there is something that, shows some kind of emotional disconnect which she expects from her children as an Indian mother. So she laments that she has given birth to vagabonds because the children are always busy in their own world, away from their parents. Asima grieves as she observes her children drifting away from the culture and values she holds dear. It encapsulates the generational distance and the pain of watching her children adapt to a world so different from her own upbringing. And this feeling is not uncommon among the parents who find that their children, adapt to a new culture, and so are different in taste, in their manners, and in their whatever they like. And in that, the parents are made to believe that, there is some kind of disconnect uh, between the children and themselves. "I can't do this," she tells Ashok, and when he attempts to reassure her, she makes her meaning clear. She tells him to hurry up and finish their degree so that they can return home and raise their child in India. So initially, Asima feels that their migration to America is for a short duration of time, and so she is in some kind of hurry and tells Ashok to finish his research work at the earliest possible, so that they can go back in India, and they can go back to India and have their child in India, because she is not comfortable bringing up her child in a country where she is utterly alone and does not have anybody who can really be around at that point in time. So Asima's discomfort and alienation in America and her wish to raise her children in the culture she understands highlights the generational and cultural gap between her and her American born children later on. So, again, the novel also talks about the power of names. All of us know that the names and naming carry a deep symbolic significance in this novel, and that is the reason why this novel is titled The Namesake. Everything surrounds uh, the naming and the name of Gogol, and it's because of the name Gogol suffers all sorts of complications, and ultimately his metamorphosis also comes when he comes to terms with his name at the end of the novel. So, pet names are a persistent remnant of childhood, a reminder that life is not always so serious. And that's why in India, there is a tradition of giving a pet name to each child, and these pet names mostly are absurd, having no meaning. They may be sing song, ping pong kind of, but still they carry lot of significance, because they signify the emotions of the people who call you by your name, and shows a certain kind of emotional connect, and that is why they are so important. Pet names are a persistent remnant of childhood, a reminder that life is not always so serious, so formal, so complicated. They are a reminder too that one is not all things to all people. So, there are some people who endearingly call you by your pet name, and they hold special significance in your life. Mostly, they are the people who are very intimate with you. So, mostly the parents and the near and dear ones who have known you since your birth, they are the people who are entitled to address you by your pet name. Otherwise, all other people address you by your good name, because they know you professionally. So, a central theme is the formation of identity in this novel, especially for second generation immigrants like Gogol and Sonia. We find how Gogol struggles with his name, a symbol of his divided self. Divided in the sense, later on he struggles with his name, because he does not find any connect with any of the cultures that he is growing in, neither India nor America, and that is the reason it leaves him uh, confused and anguished. And not only that, there are other circumstances also that lead to this, like his teacher who takes him to Gogol's personal life and tells him all the nasty things about his life, being mentally ill and perpetual melancholic. And this again makes Gogol think why, of all the names in this world, his parents were obliged to name him after somebody who himself had a very pathetic, tragic life. So Gogol is caught between his parents' Bengali heritage and his American upbringing, leading to confusion and a sense of not fully belonging to either world. So he has lot of anguish, lot of anger against his parents for naming him after somebody who is neither American nor Indian. And at the same time, all his attempts to fully assimilate into the American culture fall flat, in that he is easily singled out as being different, um, unlike the white Americans. When he is visiting Maxine's family house in Devonport, there also, during one of the gatherings, one of the friends of Maxine addresses him as a foreigner. And Maxine's mother comes to his rescue, and she says that no, Nick, his nickname, Nix, Nikhil becomes Nix. So Nix is an American like us, and he was born here. But then that itself suggests that despite all your efforts, you still remain visibly different from others, and there are people who believe that you are not fully American. So in America also he is not welcome, and traditions of India he does not find really interested and really connected to them, because he hates everything that connects him to India, that connects him to other fellow Bengalis and his parents. And that is the reason, rather than going for a college nearby, he chooses to go farther from his parents, so that he can have a life of his own. And there he changes his name, believing that he can make a new beginning. So his decision to change his name to Nikhil before leaving home for college demonstrates his desire to take control over his own identity. But unfortunately, this does not really prove uh, very fruitful. Um, so there is only one complication: he does not feel like Nikhil. Not yet. Part of the problem is that the people who now know him as Nikhil have no idea that he used to be Gogol. They know him only in the present, not at all in the past. But after 18 years of Gogol, 2 months of Nikhil feel scant, inconsequential. At times, he feels as if he's cast himself in a play, acting the part of twins, indistinguishable to the naked eye, yet fundamentally different. So he has this acute conflict within himself. Um, Quintessentially, he still feels much more attached to Gogol, although he had changed himself to Nikhil. So there is some kind of guilt consciousness within him that forces him to question his new assumed identity. He had confessed to her that he still felt guilty at times for changing his name, more so now that his father was dead, and she had assured him that it was understandable that anyone in his place would have done the same, but now it's become a joke to her. So, he later on confesses it to Mosumi as well, now that his father is gone, and he has come to know about the real reason behind his name Gogol. He feels guilt inside him for changing his name and going against the wishes of his parents. But yeah, I mean, there is no seriousness on her part to really acknowledge this. She takes it non seriously, and this further, belittles all his efforts at assuming a new identity. Webner writes, and I quote: "The power to name, to inscribe, to describe, to essentialize implies a power to invoke a world of moral relationships, a power underlined in the myth of Genesis. Naming constitutes a forceful act of leadership in its own right, so naming is so important." And at times he realizes that why there is a need to name the children so early, and why the parents have to name them. But in our culture, it's the parents prerogative, And much before a child is born, the parents start contemplating their potential names, because they believe that naming a child is their prerogative, and they feel a certain kind of emotional connect and also a sense of fulfillment in naming their children. Well, there is no such thing as a perfect name. I think that human beings should be allowed to name themselves when they turn 18. Until then, pronounce. So these lines capture Gogol's frustration with the expectations and burdens attached to his name, highlighting his struggle to define his own identity apart from cultural and familial pressures. Um, Asima, on the other hand, we find that there are traditions to be followed. In conservative Indian societies, the women never call their husbands by their first name. And in that, we find that Asima, despite migrating to America, has not really changed and is still reluctant to call Asok by his name. Osima never thinks of her husband's name when she thinks of her husband, even though she knows perfectly well what it is. Husband's name is something intimate and therefore unspoken, cleverly passed over. So, names are intimate, likened to a physical caress. It is not the utterance of the name that establishes intimacy, but on the contrary, the non utterance does that. So, the name assumes special significance in this novel because it signifies the identity, the complications arising of naming, and the ultimate, acceptance of one's identity in the case of Gogol. And again, for other characters also, it has a deep significance. Ashok is somebody who is stoic and never complains. Asima, true to her name, is limitless. And that's why, the names in this novel assume special significance. Another theme that is very prominent in this novel is home and the idea of place. The concept of home is fluid and contested throughout the novel. We find that the Ganguly family owns a house of its own at Pemberton Road, and we have also seen that in A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, how owning a house means owning your own world, your own piece of world. And that's why when they own a home or house in um, America, it is expected that they will feel at home and at peace with their house in America. But this does not happen. And towards the end, we find that the house is sold to somebody else. And Asima has decided to now spend 6 months in India and 6 months in US, while Gogol and Sonia, they have to live elsewhere. So we find that the concept of home in this novel, like many other diasporic texts, is fluid and contested, not a fixed one. For Asima and Asok, home is tied to memories of India, while for Gogol it is more ambiguous and shifting idea, as the novel suggests. And there is a time when he feels more at home in the house of Maxine rather than his own house. So, home is not a fixed entity in this novel, and they don't have a fixed idea of home. Home is not just a physical place but also state of mind shaped by relationships, rituals, and personal growth. And so Bara observes home is a mythic place of desire in the diasporic imagination. And so this also is a very prominent uh, discussion in the novel. I quote from the novel, and they in the house will be occupied by strangers. These are the last lines when Goal goes to his own room one last time, and he is reflecting upon the life afterwards. Now that the house has been sold, his father has left this world, and the mother has decided to divide her time uh, between India and America. Sonia is married and is supposed to be living elsewhere. So, reflecting on that home uh, and house that was built by his parents, and that contains lot of memories for the entire family, because the children grew up in this home itself. So he is thinking, and then the house will be occupied by strangers, and there will be no trace that they were ever there, no house to enter, no name in the telephone directory, nothing to signify the years his family has lived here, no evidence of the effort, the achievement it had been. It's hard to believe that his mother is really going, that for months she will be so far. He wonders how his parents had done it, leaving their respective families behind, seeing them so seldom, dwelling unconnected in a perpetual state of expectation, of longing. So ultimately, this acute realization of his roots and his family connection, really matures Gogol, and he finally reconciles to his Indian identity. So these lines reflect on the impermanence of home and the longing that defines the immigrant experience. So, he's not longing for the house as such, but is going to definitely miss uh, the family time that he has spent in that house with his parents. Love, marriage, and relationship, they are also very important themes. And all of us know that diasporic life also affects love, marriage, and relationships, in that we are living in a different country with different codes of conduct, different role expectations, and different kind of weightage given to different relationships. While in India, family is the prime thing, and an individual always feels in terms of his or her place in the family. The American society encourages uh, personal and individual more than the collective, and that is why relationships are different in America. So, relationships are depicted as complex and sometimes fraught with dissatisfaction, especially as characters navigate cultural expectations and personal desires. In India, marriage is considered very sacrosanct, and when it's not a marriage between two individuals alone, it's a marriage between two cultures and two families, and the two individuals who enter this holy matrimony are expected to meet certain cultural standards and expectations of both the families in order to be worthy of it. And that is the reason, the relationship between Ashok Ganguly and Asima Ganguly remains intact even when Ashok leaves this world. On the other hand, we find that Gogol and Masumi, who have been brought up in America and have been allowed to think for themselves, they enter into relationships, but none of their relationship is uh, very enduring. And so they have a different take on that. Gogol himself forms relationships with Ruth, Maxine, and Masumi. Each of the relations reflect different aspects of his identity struggle and his quest for belonging. And let's see one of these episodes from the novel. When she calls out to Ashok, she does not say his name. Asima never thinks of her husband's name when she thinks of her husband, even though she knows perfectly well what it is. Like a kiss or caress in a Hindi movie, a husband's name is something intimate and therefore unspoken, cleverly passed over. Contrary to this, in US, people call each other unhesitatingly by their names. So Gogol and Maxine and Ruth and Masumi, they call each other by their name, but then they don't attach the same kind of sacred feeling to their relationships. So it reveals the cultural nuances in relationships and the intimacy found in what remains unspoken, especially in Indian culture. Change, stability, and family. This is again one of the prominent themes. Change is a constant in the lives of Ganguly family. For Ashok's decision to move to America, to the evolving relationships between parents and children, there are a lot of changes. A novel highlights the importance of stability, family rituals, traditions, and connections provide a sense of continuity and upheaval. We find that, all the individuals and the family as such keeps evolving. Still, they try to maintain some kind of continuity by keeping your close relationship with their family back in India and the traditions to the extent possible, especially the parents. For children, it's really difficult because they don't feel the same kind of emotional connect, and they don't develop the same kind of cultural understanding of many of the traditions that are practiced back home. So, family is a constant force, something to be relied on, and that which naturally defines one's identity. This is our Indian thinking. For Ashok and Asima, family and tradition are anchors, and while for Gogol and Sonia, these can be sources of tension as they navigate their own identities in the American context. And so, the love shown by their parents and the control exercised by their parents is considered kind of limitation posed on them, and they don't really like, because they are born and brought up in a society which values individual freedom more than any kind of familial restraint. Gogol remembers having to do the same thing when he was younger. When his grandparents died, he remembers back then being bored by it, annoyed at having to observe a ritual no one else he knew followed in honor of people he had seen only a few times in his life. Now, sitting together at the kitchen table at 6:30 every evening, his father's chair empty, his meatless meal is the only thing that seems to make sense. But ultimately, Gogol realizes the true sentiments of his parents when he loses his father, because he did not feel the same kind of emotional bonding with his grandparents or the family back in India. And whenever he found his parents observing some kind of ritual for providing peace to the departed soul, especially during the ritual performed by his father during his grandparents' death, Gogol felt everything so artificial, so boring, and also felt annoyed why these people are following these meaningless rituals. But now that he has lost his father and is observing these rituals himself for his parents, he realizes what deep significance it has. And ultimately, this also shows that at last he has come to terms with his Indian roots and his Indian traditions. So these lines illustrate how family rituals, once seen as burdensome, become sources of comfort and emotional connection in the times of loss for Gogol. Um, Another very prominent theme in this novel is generational conflict. We have seen, and we have discussed earlier as well, that the first generation diasporic feel differently than the second and subsequent generations, uh, because the first generation people migrate to a foreign land having spent formative years back in India, and so find it more difficult to assimilate in the host society, whereas the children who are born in the host society find it a lot easier. Rather, they struggle with their own traditions and their heritage. So, for them, there are different sets of challenges, and again, there is a perpetual generational conflict between the parents and the children, because the children are born with a new kind of sensibility, are being growing up in a different culture with different set of values, while the parents continue to believe in their own native traditions and try their utmost best to bring up their children as per their own traditions. So this conflict is rooted in the struggle between preserving traditional Bengali identity and adapting to American society in this novel, and it shapes the characters' experiences, relationships, and sense of self. And we find a lot of difference when we compare the parents and the children, how they think about their life and how do they relate to their experiences, and what kind of thinking do they have about their relationships. The first generation Gangulis value Indian communitarianism, emphasizing family, tradition, and collective identity. In contrast, Gogol and Sonia, the second generation kids, are influenced by American individualism, prioritizing personal choice and autonomy. Gogol's struggle with his name symbolizes the broader generational rift. The act of renaming is both a rejection of parental authority and an assertion of self, highlighting the generational negotiation over identity. And as I said earlier, it's the freedom and agency that is granted to Gogol by American society. Had it been India, the last say would always have been that of the parents. So generational conflict is a very important theme in this novel. So generational conflict, we can see, is very much apparent in this novel, and throughout the novel we find how there is tension between especially Gogol and his father. There are moments when they look very intimate. The father wants to share his secrets with his son, but finds it difficult to communicate. And so ultimately when he communicates it, again the son is not very happy, and he feels cheated and deceived, and he questions why his father did not tell him earlier the real reason behind naming him Gogol. So look at these lines. At times he is conscious of the fact that his immersion in Maxine's family is a betrayal of his own. It is not simply the fact that his parents don't know about Maxine, it is his knowledge that apart from their affluence, Gerald and Lydia are secure in a way his parents will never be. He cannot imagine his parents sitting at Lydia and Gerald's table, enjoying Lydia's cooking, appreciating Gerald's selection of wine. He cannot imagine them contributing to one of their dinner party conversations, and yet here he is, night after night, a welcome addition to the Ratcliffe universe, doing just that. So he feels much more closer to American culture, which he finds much more accommodating and democratic compared to his own Indian tradition, where the parents always maintain a certain kind of distance from their children, and there is always an eerie sense of discipline even at the dinner table. If we look at Namesake as a diasporic novel, as Terry Galton writes in The Idea of Culture, that the very word culture contains the tension between making and being made. Most diaspora writers concentrate on generational differences in exploring how new and old diasporas relate to their land of origin and the host culture. So, Jhumpa Lahiri has said the question of identity is always a difficult one, but especially for those who are culturally displaced, as immigrants are who grow up in two worlds simultaneously. So, in the namesake, she reflects on the Indian diaspora and creates a narrative that reveals the inconsistency of the concept of identity and cultural differences in the space of diaspora. So the title, the namesake itself reflects the struggle Gogol Ganguly goes through to identify with his unusual name. The novel represents the experience of a very specific community which has to name, thereby focusing on cultural dislocations as the story evolves from the birth of the son to the death of the father. And so we find that all through the novel, um, this Indian culture and the American uh, demands, they always keep them on their toes, and there is a perpetual tension. As Vivioka states, uh, when a diaspora community is constantly rejected or interiorized while only wanting to be included either socially or culturally, or when this group or this individual is racially discriminated and demonized under the argument of a supposed cultural different, then the individual or the group is embarrassed, and this eventually leads to a self definition and behaviors based on this culture, and eventually racial distinction as well. And we find this happening in this particular novel. Despite the best of efforts, they still go back to their roots because they are not accepted in the host society. So parents Ashok and Asima do their utmost best to create a Bengali ambience for their children Gogol and Sonia by arranging all Bengali get-togethers, celebrating their own festivals. But the two, as they grew in a hybrid culture, part Bengali, part American, gingerly respond to their parents' efforts to create a homeland in America, an oasis of Bengali culture. So we find that despite the sincere efforts made by these immigrant parents, the children who grow up in American society don't really adapt to their native culture the way their parents feel attached to them. So the namesake is a perfect reference for Lahiri's story about the strangeness of the Indian immigrant experience in the United States, and that is somewhat true also because the child of immigrants begins in a kind of somewhere nowhere place, as McWan observes. Gogol or even Lahiri is firmly of America but is not quite an American, in part because they are not recognized as such by others. So, Lahiri's migrant women whose origins lie in the third world are placed by her on the periphery of the first world, as is most visibly observed in the case of Asima. Mosumi appears to be seeking a centrality in the first world which eludes her, as she is constantly renegotiating her identity within the paradigms of her conflicted personal history. Only in Sonia, Lahiri's American born, not confused diasporic protagonist, does the reader observe the diasporic identity shifting into a transnational center at the heart of the host nation. So we find that only Sonia comes to this near ideal of assimilation, carving a new identity and settling well to the call of America. Asima, on the other hand, personifies what Bara terms the homing desire of the migrant. The novel commences with the writer portraying Asima as a reluctant migrant of fixed origins. Asima's initial hostile reaction to her uh, host country is rooted in the culturally discursive alienation that is a quotidian experience of her life in America. But later on, we find that she accepts this reality and forges a new identity. The translation of her Bengali identity into a Bengali American one takes the form of being a focal point for a new Bengali migrants for new Bengali migrants, and ensuring that adjustment to American life never translates into assimilation. As Clifford points out, it is selective accommodation, the need to stay and be different simultaneously, and in the process, identity becomes syncretic. So, the diasporic people, try to adjust to the extent possible so that they can lead fruitful, peaceful life. Translation here means the interaction of cultures, the transfer of cultural experience, the concern with cultural borders, and the articulation of liminal experience and intercultural understanding. Uh, Bijay Misra's observation: all diasporas are unhappy, but every diaspora is unhappy in its own way, provides an insight into Asima's situation. The new mother, who after marrying Ashok and moving to cold Massachusetts, longs for family and pleads with Ashok that she does not wish to bring child up alone in a foreign country. To Asima, America is always a place that has hosted her, albeit a hosting that was neither reluctant nor hostile, perhaps indifferent to some extent. Asima's identity is created and renegotiated within the choices made for her by her family, by husband, and later by his death, a lifetime in a fist, as he ruminates. So Mausumi and Asima both have seamless, borderless existences. Asima's name itself is used by the author to denote her as ultimately the one without borders. Asima's translations of identity and her final renegotiation of herself as a woman comfortable in straddling two worlds evolve over time using strategies drawn from the strength of discourses within which she locates her own self. So, her final decision to make peace both with her roots back in India, as she has decided to spend 6 months in a room of her own in the house of her brother in the Salt Lake locality of Kolkata, Calcutta, known as Calcutta earlier, and 6 months in America finally accounts for her acceptance of her dual identity. So, here America can be read as the nurturing site of this translation of an arranged marriage into a love relationship as she prepares to depart from her present space and newly step into another world space. Asima muses that she will miss the country in which she had grown to know and love her husband. So, she also realizes ultimately the transforming power of the host country. David Kippen writes, protagonist's true identity is hung up somewhere between India and the United States. Names have always been contested territory in immigrant families, and finally, that in the world of literature, Lahiri writes like a native. So, friends, this turns out to be one of the memorable pieces for generations to come. As it is rich, character driven novel that explores what it means to live between cultures. Lahiri does not provide dramatic climaxes, but instead captures the subtle emotional evolution of her characters. Gogol's journey shows that identity is not static or singular, it is layered, evolving, and deeply tied to memory, loss, and love. So, it turns out to be one of the memorable diasporic novels of Indian diaspora. So, friends, these are the references. Thank you very much. Please join me for the next class. I'll be discussing the most uh, well known work of Jhumpa Lahiri, interpreter of melodies. Thank you very much.